The temperature had plummeted to around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, but cold sweat streamed down my face, blinding my eyes as I desperately tried to keep my balance on the uneven ground. The memory card inside that camera weighed more than lead in my pocket, because I knew exactly what was recorded on it. It wasn't a sick coyote, it wasn't a disoriented grizzly bear, and it definitely wasn't a human being in a costume. What I had captured on video was the personification of pure primal terror, a gigantic alpha predator, and worst of all, it knew I had the recording. I could feel the heavy vibration of its footsteps hitting the frozen ground less than 100 feet behind me, each step devouring the distance between us, with a speed impossible for any normal bipedal creature. Its breathing was a deep, damp noise, a guttural sound of pure fury and hunger that echoed through the dense forest and paralyzed my soul. I didn't dare look back, for I knew that if my eyes met that amber gleam reflecting in the darkness, my legs would simply give way. All I could do was run toward the safety of the big house, praying that the wooden structure would withstand the impact of whatever was about to crash into it. I was a logical man, a man of the earth who had spent his entire life dealing with common predators, but the monstrous presence that hunted me now broke all the rules of biology and sanity. It was massive, an anomaly of nature with shoulders broad enough to block the moonlight filtering through the trees, and I knew with absolute certainty, in the pit of my stomach, that I wouldn't survive this night if I didn't reach the front door within the next 30 seconds. To understand how I reached this point of utter despair, it's necessary to go back a few weeks and understand the geography of my isolation. I had bought this ranch in Taos, New Mexico, seeking the peace and quiet that only an 800-acre property surrounded by miles of national forest could offer. The nearest town, with its solitary gas station and convenience store, was more than 35 miles away, along a winding, poorly maintained dirt road. My main house, a sturdy hardwood and stone structure, stood isolated in the center of the property, at least 400 feet from the edge of the dense forest that surrounded the pastures. For the first few months, it was absolute paradise, but I soon began to realize that the vastness of New Mexico hides secrets that modern civilization prefers to ignore. There were constant reports on the local radio about hikers disappearing in the most remote areas of the state parks, experienced people who simply vanished without leaving a single trace, piece of equipment, or piece of clothing behind. I used to attribute these disappearances to dehydration, mountain lion attacks, or the treacherous terrain that featured abrupt drops of over 200 feet. However, the atmosphere around the ranch began to subtly shift as winter approached. The forest surrounding my property, once teeming with the sounds of owls, insects, and small nocturnal mammals, became oppressively silent. It was a heavy silence, the kind of soundlessness that occurs in nature only when a top predator enters the territory, causing all other animals to hide in silent panic. I found myself staring out the kitchen window at night, gazing into the absolute darkness that swallowed the trees hundreds of feet away, feeling an indescribable and constant sensation that something endowed with a wicked intelligence was watching me from behind. Denial is a very powerful human defense mechanism, but it completely crumbled the morning I encountered the first physical sign that something was terribly wrong on my land. The sun had barely begun to rise, illuminating the pasture with a pale, cold light, when I went out to check on the cattle near the old barn, about 500 feet from the main residence. The air was heavy with a thick, metallic smell of blood and something rotten that resembled spoiled meat, mixed with the acrid odor of a dirty kennel. I found a calf weighing almost 300 pounds lying in the middle of the field, and the sight of what remained of it made my stomach churn violently. The most disturbing part wasn't the slaughter itself, but the impossible logistics of the scene. There were no trails of blood dragged across the frozen ground, indicating that the creature hadn't slaughtered the calf and dragged it away to eat. The animal had been lifted completely off the ground, as if it weighed less than a sack of feathers, and its chest had been surgically and brutally ripped open by claws that must have been as thick as steel blades. The barbed wire fence, 7 feet high and encircling that particular section of the pasture, was intact, with no broken wires or bent posts. The predator, whatever it was, hadn't dug under the fence or forced its way through. It had simply leaped over a 7-foot barrier, carrying a 300-pound animal in its jaws or arms. I stood there in the morning chill, clutching my hunting rifle in trembling hands, gazing out at the vast expanse of trees. The wind blew through the dry branches, but there wasn't a single bird song for miles around. The primal instinct that humans have forgotten they possess began to scream in my mind, warning me that I was in the center of the hunting territory of something formidable, and that the calf was merely a warning sign, a test of strength to gauge my response to its dominance. The need to understand what was decimating my livestock led me to inspect the perimeter of the property with obsessive, terrified focus. I walked slowly along the western edge of the ranch, where the open pasture met the steep slope that descended to a shallow creek, searching for any physical sign of the intruder. It was in the partially frozen mud near the creek bank that I found the mark that shattered my understanding of terrestrial biology. At first I thought it was the footprint of an abnormally large bear, but as I bent down and meticulously observed its proportions, fear turned my blood to ice. The print measured an impressive 14 inches from heel to the tip of the longest claw. It had the general shape of a canid's paw, with the characteristic pads of a wolf, but it was grotesquely elongated and structured in a way that would support the weight of a creature walking upright. I pressed my own boot against the mark for comparison, and my oversized boot looked childish next to the deep furrow that thing had left in the hard ground. The claws had pierced the frozen earth with devastating force, and as I followed the trail, I noticed that the spacing between one footprint and the next was almost 6 feet. This indicated a wide bipedal stride. The creature was walking on 2 legs with astonishing ease and naturalness. An intense chill ran down my spine as I realized that these marks didn't follow the normal escape route of a frightened animal, but rather intelligently patrolled the blind spots of my property. It was mapping the terrain, studying my routines, memorizing the location of doors, windows, and the weakest points in my fences. The sense of security I had within the walls of my house evaporated instantly. I wasn't dealing with a wild animal searching for food. I was being strategically cornered by an entity that possessed tactical planning and a malicious intelligence incredibly superior to that of any common predator in North America. Determined to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy, I grabbed the best trail camera with night vision and motion sensor that I owned and securely fastened it to the trunk of a massive oak tree 80 feet from the back of my house, pointed directly at the clearing where the calf had been left. I connected the camera's signal to my office monitor via a wireless receiver so I could watch the perimeter from the safety of my home. That night, the temperature plummeted to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and a thick fog began to form near the ground, engulfing the pastures in a whitish blanket. I locked all the doors, checked all the windows, and sat down at the monitor, accompanied only by a mug of bitter coffee and my loaded shotgun resting in my lap. The first few hours were agonizingly dull, only the wind moving the branches on the black and white screen. But precisely at 2 in the morning, the screen flickered as the motion sensor activated. My heart stopped for a full second. On the right edge of the monitor, emerging from the absolute darkness of the forest, an immeasurable silhouette entered the camera's field of vision. It was gigantic, I estimate at least 8 feet tall, standing perfectly erect on 2 muscular legs covered in dense, dark fur that absorbed the little infrared light. The musculature of its chest and shoulders was disproportionately wide, resembling the physique of a human bodybuilder, but its thick neck supported the head of a monstrous wolf with pointed ears and an elongated snout. It stopped in the center of the clearing, not to eat or investigate the area, but to stare directly at the lens of the camera mounted on the tree. It knew it was there. Through the screen, I saw the lips of that aberration curve back, revealing rows of massive teeth in a smile that blended the predatory animal aspect with a frighteningly human malice. O terror me paralisou na cadeira enquanto eu percebia que ele não estava sozinho. Nas sombras atrás dele, na linha das árvores a cerca de 200 pés de distância, pelo menos 3 outros pares de olhos brilhantes surgiram na escuridão. O alfa fixou seu olhar na câmera e, lentamente, levantou um braço longo apontando um dedo com garras enormes em direção à minha casa. That long pointed finger pointing directly at my house through the security monitor changed my reality forever. That very night, the temperature outside had dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the cold seemed to radiate through the solid wood walls of my house, freezing not only the surroundings, but my very blood. The ranch I had bought in Taos, once my picturesque retreat, had suddenly transformed into an isolated prison in the middle of nowhere. The property consisted of a 2-story main house of about 3,000 square feet, built in the center of a clearing, flanked by rugged mountains and pine forests, so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground during the day. The nearest paved road was 25 miles away, accessible only by a dirt track riddled with potholes and loose rocks that would ruin the suspension of any speeding pickup truck. I was completely alone. The realization that this incredibly muscular genetic anomaly, a monstrous bipedal wolf defying all natural laws, not only existed but also led a coordinated pack, shattered my sanity. He had an understanding of visual tools. He knew what a camera was, and knew I was watching from the other side. The sense of security that locked doors provided became a bad joke. The walls of my ranch, which had seemed so robust when I signed the deeds, now looked like they were made of diaphanous cardboard. The darkness surrounding the house, stretching for endless acres, was no longer just the absence of light, but a thick, living ocean, inhabited by horrors that modern civilization has forgotten exist. I spent the rest of that early morning sitting in the darkest corner of my living room, gripping my 12-gauge rifle tightly enough to leave my knuckles completely white, listening to the wind whistling through the cracks in the windows and expecting the wood of the front door to explode into pieces at any second. When the pale morning light finally broke the darkness, illuminating the frost that covered the window panes, I made the decision to drive into town to buy safety supplies. The 35-mile drive to the Taos hardware store seemed to last an eternity, my eyes constantly scanning the line of trees along the dirt road, hoping to spot one of those immense figures running parallel to my truck. Upon arriving in town, the normal, everyday atmosphere of the place caused me a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. People strolled along the sidewalk sipping hot coffee, oblivious to the nightmare that lurked in the forests just beyond the town limits. Inside the hardware store I found the owner, an elderly man named Arthur, whose family had lived in the mountainous region of New Mexico for over 4 generations. As I stacked heavy steel locks, 6-inch bolts, thick planks of wood, and motion sensors on the counter, he watched me with a stern, knowing gaze. Without me needing to explain my nervousness or the deep, dark circles under my eyes, Arthur commented in a low, cautious tone that the harsh winter of that year was bringing the old ghosts of the forest closer to the properties. He didn't use the word monster or creature, but spoke in a veiled way about the Nightwalkers, entities that the natives of the region swore could mimic human and animal form, possessing a strength that could break spines and tear steel. Arthur warned me grimly that if those things decided that my territory now belonged to them, no amount of locks or wood would stop them from entering. The conversation was brief and free of direct questions, but the message was clear. The local legends weren't stories to scare unsuspecting hikers around campfires. They were survival guides based on spilled blood. I returned to the ranch in the early afternoon, with the sun already beginning to set on the horizon, casting long shadows more than 40 feet across the yard. Time was running out quickly. I immediately began the exhausting task of transforming my house into an impenetrable fortress, although deep down I knew I was merely building my own cage. I reinforced the front and back doors by screwing solid oak bars crosswise into the frames, using incredibly thick steel screws that penetrated deep into the house's structure. I covered all the first-floor windows with thick plywood sheets, leaving only small gaps less than 2 inches wide so I could observe the outside. The physical exertion made me sweat profusely, even though the internal temperature didn't exceed 55 degrees Fahrenheit. With each hammer blow, each sound of metal scraping against wood, I felt an agonizing tightness in my chest, a growing paranoia that the noise of my tools was alerting the pack that the prey was aware of the hunt. I scattered powerful motion-activated spotlights within a 50-foot radius around the house, hoping the sudden light would intimidate them, or at least give me a split-second advantage. But the brutal truth is that no equipment in the world could erase the memory of the animal's muscular strength, as it carried a heavy calf over a 7-foot-high fence, as if it were a mere piece of cloth. Human logic urged me to barricade myself, but my deepest survival instinct screamed that hiding from a top predator would only prolong the inevitable bloodbath. The transition from afternoon to night was the most terrifying process I have ever experienced. When the sun finally disappeared behind the mountain peaks, the temperature plummeted to below freezing, and a thick layer of icy fog began to creep from the forest floor toward my house. The silence that settled over the property was thick, heavy, and profoundly unnatural. There wasn't the slightest rustle of leaves, no chirping of nocturnal birds, absolutely nothing but the sound of my own panting breath in the dark interior of the room. It was then that the smells began to seep through the cracks in the barricaded walls. First, a putrid smell of rotting flesh mixed with wet earth, quickly followed by a pungent, musky odor that stung the nostrils, similar to the smell of a wet dog, but 1,000 times more intense and savage. This fetid aroma was a chemical signature of dominance, warning any living creature in the area that the master of the forest had arrived to claim what was his. I turned off all the interior lights in the house, plunging the room into total darkness to avoid creating silhouettes against the barricaded windows, and positioned myself near the crack I'd left in the kitchen window. My whole body trembled, not only from the paralyzing cold, but from the massive adrenaline rush flooding my nervous system. Through the small opening in the wood, I observed the stretch of yard illuminated by the faint moonlight. The tension in the air was so thick, I felt as if I could cut it with a knife. I knew the pack was no longer hidden, hundreds of feet away. They had already crossed the invisible line of my lawn, moving with a stealth impossible for creatures of such colossal size. The confirmation of the intrusion came without any loud warning, but with a surgical and terrifying precision that sent chills down my spine. The first of the motion-activated spotlights, positioned exactly 30 feet from the back door, suddenly lit up, bathing part of the yard in a blinding white light. Through the gap in my barricade, I held my breath. There was nothing visible under the light, but I knew the sensor didn't trigger with the wind. Then I heard the sound. It was a slow, deep, and incredibly heavy scratching against the exterior wood siding of the west wall of the house, just a few feet from where I was crouching. Claws tore through the solid wood with disturbing ease, like sharp blades slowly descending over cardboard. What made me almost completely panicked wasn't the act itself, but the height at which the sound was being produced. The tearing in the wood was happening almost 9 feet above the ground outside. No bear in New Mexico could reach that height while maintaining a stable enough foothold to apply such destructive force against a vertical wall. The creature stood on 2 legs, leaning against my house, testing the structural integrity of my refuge with predatory patience. Soon after, A second spotlight illuminated the front of the property, and a similar sound of claws scraping against the front door echoed through the house. They had completely surrounded me. They were gauging my defenses, communicating silently through tactical movements, coordinating a meticulous siege. My house, reinforced with steel and wood, ceased to be a shield and became a fragile wooden box, and the monsters outside knew exactly how to open the lid. The physical confrontation, the nightmare in flesh and blood, was only inches and moments away. Absolute terror isn't noisy. It manifests in the absence of sound and the anticipation of what's to come. After the initial test of my defenses, the creatures outside plunged the property into a sepulchral silence. The temperature had dropped to a brutal 5 degrees Fahrenheit below zero, which should have frozen any unprotected living being, but these things seemed to thrive in the extreme cold. Crouched on the kitchen floor, my back against the oak cabinets, I began to feel a rhythmic vibration rising through the wooden planks beneath the soles of my boots. It wasn't an audible sound, but rather an ultra-low frequency, an air pressure that made my teeth ache and my chest vibrate uncomfortably. They were communicating. Without long howls or barks, the pack members used a form of infrasound or guttural noise low enough to travel through the frozen ground and the house's foundations. This tactic made me realize how advanced these predators were compared to any common wolf. They were coordinating their positions, establishing a containment perimeter around the two-story structure, making sure there were no escape routes within 100 feet of open field that I could attempt to cross. The heat of my own breath in the frigid room air formed dense clouds of vapor, and the only thing keeping me sane was the firm grip on the cold metal of my rifle. I knew my ammunition was limited, only lead-shot cartridges designed for big game hunting, but I seriously doubted that any conventional civilian firearm would be sufficient to stop an 800-pound monster that moved with such agility. I was just a man trying to protect his territory, but to them I was just a game of patience, prey trapped in a box that would soon be opened. The false sense of control that the electricity had given me vanished when the outside spotlights began flickering erratically. It wasn't a natural mechanical failure. The main breaker box and transmission pole were about 60 feet from the side porch, and I could clearly hear the tearing of metal and the snapping of thick cables being ripped from their connections with indescribable brute force. In an instant, the entire house plunged into absolute darkness. My camera system monitor went blank, the faint hum of the refrigerator ceased, and I was blinded in my own refuge. The backup generator was located in a locked shed 40 feet from the back door, which meant it was completely out of reach. Leaving the house would amount to instant suicide. The darkness painfully intensified all my other senses. The bestial, sulphurous odor of wet dog, rotting meat and damp earth seeped through the cracks in the window with nauseating intensity, filling the 300 square feet of my kitchen. My eyes desperately tried to adjust to the lack of light, searching for shapes in the shadows, while my mind filled the void with images of the alpha creature watching me through the floorboards. The darkness made the invasion even more tactical. They knew that darkness was their advantage. I could hear the rustling of heavy footsteps crushing the frozen grass inches from the living room wall, patrolling the area at a slow, methodical, and mocking pace. He wanted me to know that my sight had been taken away, that my technological advantage had been destroyed with a simple tug of his massive arms, and that now the game would be played entirely under the rules of primal nature. The tension reached an unbearable level when I heard the sound of something violently scraping against the outer side of the second floor. The alpha predator wasn't just circling the house, it was climbing the structure. The house was over 25 feet high to the peak of the roof, but the sound of claws digging into the wood demonstrated that the climb had been accomplished in a matter of seconds. The entire structure creaked under the impact of a colossal weight landing on the tiles directly above my head. Dust and small fragments of plaster began to fall from the kitchen ceiling, covering my shoulders and the floor around me. It walked on two legs up there, its steps producing heavy, spaced-out impacts that made the supporting beams protest with a long, agonizing groan. It was like hearing a small truck being maneuvered on top of my house. The psychological fear of having that abomination positioned at a superior vantage point was paralyzing. He walked the length of the roof, from the east side to the west side, stopping directly above the area where the fireplace in the main room was located. I held my breath as I heard the sound of his claws scratching at the masonry of the chimney, probing, searching for weak points, assessing whether the space was large enough to force entry. The smell became overwhelmingly concentrated, descending through the fireplace flue and permeating the upholstered furniture. I stood paralyzed, pointing my shotgun at the ceiling, knowing perfectly well that shooting through the solid wood would be a waste of ammunition and would only reveal my exact position inside the house. I was completely at the mercy of that creature's decision to destroy or spare the roof above my head. The weight above me finally shifted, and the sound of a heavy jump echoed outside, followed by a monumental impact on the frozen ground a few feet from the barricaded kitchen window where I had left my small observation slit. My heart pounded against my ribs with such violent force that I thought I would suffer a heart attack right there. I dragged my body slowly across the cold ceramic floor, moving inch by inch until my face was close to the narrow crack, dimly lit by a solitary ray of moonlight piercing the mist. I only wanted to confirm his position, to make sure he was still outside, but what I saw through that 2-inch opening changed my soul forever. A huge incandescent eye, the color of liquid amber, was positioned exactly on the other side of the crack, staring directly inside. The eyeball was the size of a billiard ball, with a vertical pupil that dilated in the dark. The distance between us was the thickness of a plywood sheet and a pane of glass. He saw me. His gaze didn't carry the irrational aggression of an angry animal, but rather a cold, calculating, and profoundly sadistic intelligence. His warm, moist breath fogged the window pane and seeped through the crack, splashing tiny droplets of foul condensation onto my face. I was petrified, unable to blink or pull my face away from the crack, locked in eye contact with the pinnacle of terrestrial predation. His dark lips parted on the other side, and I could hear a low, rasping, rhythmic sound coming from his throat, a noise that perfectly mimicked the sound of my own panting breath, as if he were mocking my terror. The terrifying trance of eye contact was brutally broken when a massive kinetic impact struck the front door, located nearly 30 feet from the kitchen. The force of the blow was so devastating that the entire house trembled, and several pictures tumbled from the living room walls, shattering the glass against the floor. I scurried down the dark hallway, icy sweat soaking my clothes in the near-glacial temperature. Upon reaching the living room, the dim light revealed the beginning of the end. The front door, which I had reinforced with 6-inch steel bolts and solid oak crossbars, displayed a grotesque warping in the center. The thick metal hinges were twisted, and the bolts were beginning to give way, pulling entire chunks of the doorframe away and revealing the wall's thermal insulation. The Alpha was no longer playing games. He had decided that the time for psychological torture was over, and that it was time to begin the massacre. The sound of claws scraping furiously against the exterior wood merged with the heavy bodily impacts that made the door creak and groan like a sinking ship. Primal panic finally took complete control of my brain. I raised my 12-gauge shotgun, fitted the butt firmly against my shoulder, and pointed the trembling barrel at the center of the door, unlocking the weapon with my sweaty thumb. The wooden beams began to splinter audibly and violently, sending splinters flying through the air with each new thrust from the 800-pound monster outside. I recoiled slowly, feeling the baseboard of the wall touch the heels of my boots, realizing that the only physical barrier between my body and the teeth of that lycanthropic creature was about to explode into 1,000 pieces, leaving me completely defenseless for the most brutal phase of the nightmare. You listening to this account in the comfort of your room, with the doors locked and the light on, pay close attention to the shadows around you, because the false sense of security is humanity's greatest mistake. I learned this the hard way when the thick door of my living room, made of solid oak and reinforced with metal plates, gave way under the crushing weight of that biological anomaly. The entire door frame was ripped from the house's structure, sending razor-sharp splinters of wood and 6-inch screws flying through the air, crossing the 20 feet that separated us and striking the walls behind me. The room's internal temperature, already a frigid 20 degrees Fahrenheit due to lack of heating, seemed to plummet instantly when the presence of the alpha predator filled the shattered entrance. It was colossal. Standing on its hind legs amidst the wreckage of my door, its head almost grazed the ceiling, which was exactly 9 feet high. Its shoulders were disproportionately wide, easily measuring over 3 feet from side to side, covered in a dense black fur that seemed to absorb the little silvery moonlight that filtered through the opening. The smell of decay and damp earth invaded my house like a toxic wave, choking my lungs and making me gag. I kept my 12-gauge shotgun firmly pressed against my shoulder, my hands trembling so violently that the barrel of the gun swayed in the dark. The creature didn't advance immediately. It remained perfectly still in the doorway, completely blocking any escape route to the yard, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent, focused amber hue. It was as if it were savoring my despair, watching my body frozen in fear before making its final strike. The silence that followed the door being forced open was dense and absolute, broken only by the harsh, deep sound of that incarnate nightmare's breathing. The instinct for self-preservation is an uncontrollable force that often acts even before the brain processes the situation. When the alpha male took its first step into my living room, the monstrous claw of its right paw piercing the thick carpet and scratching the hardwood floor at least 2 inches deep, my finger pulled the trigger. The flash of the shot illuminated the entire room for a fraction of a second, revealing the taut muscles and absurdly developed anatomy of the monster. The force of the rifle's recoil bruised my shoulder, but the impact of the lead cartridge, designed to take down 800-pound animals, was deposited directly into the creature's broad chest from a distance of only 15 feet. Logic dictated that any biological being would be thrown backward by the kinetic force of the impact, or at least suffer a lethal, incapacitating wound. Reality, however, mocked every law of physics I knew. The monster merely gave a short jolt backward, its claws digging gigantic furrows into the hardwood floor to maintain its balance. The dense fur on his chest seemed to have absorbed most of the damage, and he showed no sign of acute pain or hesitation. Instead of collapsing, his black leathery lips twitched back, exposing rows of razor-sharp white teeth, measuring at least 3 inches each. The expression on the beast's face was not that of a wounded animal fighting for its life, but rather that of a supreme predator, deeply offended and infinitely enraged. The 12-gauge shot served no defense. It served only as a lethal insult that exhausted what little patience the creature had for its prey. The animal's fury was immediate and overwhelming. It charged across the living room, covering the 12 feet that separated us in just 2 long, terrifyingly quick strides. My survival reflex kicked in, and I threw myself backward, rolling over the heavy coffee table, just as one of its massive arms crossed the space where my head had been a millisecond before. The force of the blow cut through the air above me with impressive pressure and crushed the back of an old armchair, as if it were made of styrofoam. The upholstery flew across the dark room. I crawled on my knees across the cold floor, cocking the shotgun for the next shot, but panic made me miss the mark and the cartridge jammed in the chamber. I was unarmed less than 10 feet from hell in wolf form. I crawled furiously toward the narrow hallway that led to the kitchen and the basement stairs. The house, which had been my secluded refuge, had become a cramped and terrifying labyrinth. I could hear the monster's heavy footsteps walking behind me, each impact making the floorboards groan under the estimated weight of nearly 900 pounds. The constant sound of claws tearing through my wooden floor marked the rhythm of the hunt. To worsen the already desperate situation, I noticed shadows moving through the barricaded windows of the living room. The other members of the pack, those who had cornered me outside, were circling the destroyed porch, waiting for the Alpha to finish the job so they could enter and feast on what was left. Their sadistic and coordinated intelligence was undeniable. They had established a closed perimeter around a cage that was already open. There was no way to fight and no way to escape to the outside without being torn apart by the other monsters lurking just a few feet from the house's structure. My only and last chance to keep breathing was the reinforced door of the old food storage cellar, located at the end of the main hallway. Lifting my body and running down the narrow corridor was the greatest physical and mental effort I had ever undertaken. The icy air punished my throat, and I could smell the creature's thick, sulphurous breath right behind me, inches from the collar of my jacket. I threw myself against the heavy wooden door reinforced with steel locks, turning the handle with the force of desperation and plummeting into the darkness of the cellar. Before even reaching the bottom of the steps, I stretched out my arm and slammed the door shut with all my might. Turning the heavy industrial locks at the exact moment, a massive body collided with the structure on the other side. The force was so absurd that the door jambs visibly cracked, and dust fell from the supporting beams above my head. But the steel plates and thick half-inch latches withstood the initial impact. I rolled down the wooden steps to the cold concrete floor of the basement, which was immersed in impenetrable darkness, and maintained a freezing temperature close to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The subterranean space measured about 15 feet by 20 feet, surrounded by thick concrete walls. It was locked. I was a prisoner in my own grave, buried beneath my own house, accompanied only by absolute darkness and the weight of the terrible realization that the worst was yet to come. The feeling of being momentarily safe in the concrete basement evaporated in the fraction of a second I looked at the wooden ceiling that separated me from the first floor. The reinforced door at the top of the stairs had withstood the initial assault, but the alpha predator was too ingenious to attempt to force its way through by simply taking the most obvious route. Above my head, I heard the monster's heavy, slow footsteps, walking methodically across the hallway floor, positioning itself directly over the center of the subterranean room. It knew exactly where I was hiding. Silence filled the room for agonizing moments, and then the physical, tangible terror began. Its claws began to furiously tear at the wooden floor above my head. Thick strips of oak and sharp splinters rained down on me as the creature burrowed through the floor like a furious dog, trying to unearth a bone hidden in the earth. Despair paralyzed me. I cowered in the darkest, most remote corner of the 15-foot room, hugging my legs and watching helplessly as the wood gave way and shattered. An irregular hole, measuring just over 2 feet in diameter, was excavated in the center of the ceiling. Through this grotesque opening, the faint moonlight from the hallway penetrated the basement, followed by a sight that shattered any remaining courage I possessed. The alpha male's head descended through the opening, its monstrous snout and retracted jaws dripping thick saliva that splattered onto the concrete inches from my shoe. Its amber eyes darted in the darkness until they focused directly on me, huddled in the corner of the wall. It thrust its muscular arm of terrifying proportions through the hole, extending its enormous claws toward me. The tips of the blades dug into the concrete, a hand's breadth from my knee. We were so close I could feel the heat of its breath against the 10-degree Fahrenheit chill. The ultimate confrontation wasn't a fight. It was complete paralysis under the uncontested dominion of the most lethal monster nature has ever concealed from humanity. That gigantic arm tearing through the air, inches from my face, was the definitive moment when my mind accepted death completely. Huddled in that dark, damp corner of the basement, the temperature plummeting even further to a cruel 8 degrees Fahrenheit, I watched the alpha predator attempt to widen the 2-foot diameter hole in the wooden ceiling. The dense smell of rot and wild musk was so suffocating in that confined 15 by 20-foot space that I felt violently nauseous, struggling to maintain what little sanity I had left. The thick claws, measuring almost 4 inches long, scraped furiously against the reinforced concrete of the floor above, failing to reach me by a stupidly small margin. I could clearly see the thick tendons beneath the dark fur of the creature's forearm contracting with overwhelming force, a power that could easily rip the door off a steel safe. He emitted a deep, guttural sound, an aggressive vibration that shook the dust accumulated on the support beams above my head. But soon he seemed to grasp a crucial engineering detail that shaped the unfolding of the night. To create a space wide enough for his 800-pound body to physically descend to the basement, he would need to shatter the main oak beam that ran through the structural center of the floor. If he forced that support pillar to break, the integrity of the 3,000-square-foot center foundation would completely collapse, and the entire roof, along with the massive weight of the second floor, would fall directly on him in a lethal heap of sharp debris and heavy wood. The perverse intelligence of that anomaly became tragically evident there. Instead of succumbing to the blind fury of a mere animal and destroying his own ground, he interrupted the direct attack. His muscular arm was slowly retracted through the riddled opening, and his bright amber eyes fixed on me through the broken wood for a time that seemed to last a lifetime. He understood perfectly that I was trapped in darkness, knew that I had no alternative escape routes, and decided in an act of sadistic superiority that the psychological torture of the siege was a far more interesting game than mutual burying. The long hours that followed were a complete immersion in mental insanity. I remained paralyzed in the exact same defensive position, hugging my aching knees, while the invisible clock of that cursed night mercilessly ticked away. The alpha male lay heavily on the living room floor, positioned directly above the excavated hole, and I could perfectly hear his damp breath, the hot, fetid air descending in continuous gusts into the cold basement. Occasionally, he would purposefully drag his claws along the edge of the splintered wood of the ceiling, sending a light rain of splinters onto my sweat-soaked hair, just to keep me in a constant state of panic and remind me that he was still up there, watching his prey in the underground cage. Outside the walls of the house, the rest of the pack maintained an active and oppressive siege. I could hear the impact of massive footsteps repeatedly crushing the frozen backyard floor, patrolling the property boundaries within a meticulous 100-foot radius, ensuring that absolutely nothing approached to help me or that I attempted a suicidal run. The intense, prolonged cold was taking a heavy toll on my fatigued body. My fingers and toes were completely numb, and uncontrollable spasms shook my weary muscles as my body struggled futilely to generate any warmth under the relentless 8 degrees Fahrenheit of the concrete basement. The mental exhaustion and physical wear and tear were of such magnitude that I began to suffer visual blackouts, dark moments in which my exhausted mind tried to shut down my nervous system to escape that unthinkable and torturous torment. However, with each tiny, creaking sound of floorboards or each subtle change in the breathing rhythm of the vigilant monster above, my body injected a massive new surge of adrenaline into my bloodstream, keeping me awake and perfectly aware that my violent end was mere inches away. The geographical isolation of the city of Taos, which had once represented my own private paradise, had transformed into the arena of a one-sided hunt where the biological rules known to humanity had been severely rewritten by monstrous beings. It was only when the color of the outer sky began to transition from a deep black to a pale shade of gray-blue that the dynamics of the oppressive siege shifted. Through the small opening in the ceiling and the cracks in the violently destroyed floorboards, I could see the faint light of dawn beginning to seep through the shattered windows of the main floor. Entities with that insane level of predatory power clearly do not fear the sun's rays, but the darkness of night is undoubtedly the tactical cloak they prefer to use to operate without facing visual interference from human civilization. I felt the heavy vibration of the floorboards change drastically when the alpha male finally rose from his guard post. The monumental weight of his body made the wooden structure creak for a prolonged and frighteningly loud time. He didn't run off desperately. He didn't retreat hastily like a coyote caught in the morning. Instead, his exit from that living nightmare was slow, calculated, deliberate, and imbued with pure territorial arrogance. He walked slowly to the jagged edge of the dug hole one last time and inhaled deeply and audibly the stagnant air of the basement, a movement designed to register my scent of utter panic in his sensory memory forever. Then heavy, deafening footsteps echoed across the living room floor, descended what remained of the front porch structure, and reached the wet earth of the outer yard. Following the leader in perfect synchrony, the other colossal members of the pack began to retreat simultaneously, their rhythmic steps moving toward the edge of the dense forest 300 feet away, until the heavy vibration of the footsteps dissipated completely in the vastness of the icy morning air. The sepulchral silence that settled over the property soon after was not the serene silence of untouched nature, but rather the heavy, traumatic silence of a disaster zone after a devastating storm. My brain refused to send motor commands to my legs. Mesmo com a certeza visual de que o sol havia despontado, permaneci encolhido no canto de concreto áspero por mais 3 horas agonizantes e silenciosas, dominado pela suspeita cruel de que o recuo da matilha fosse apenas mais uma artimanha daquela inteligência maliciosa. Only when the bright, comforting light of the mid-morning sun finally illuminated the center of the basement broadly and intensely did I find the physical and mental strength to stand. My legs were so numb and trembling that they almost gave way under the weight of my own fatigued body. I climbed the rough wooden steps extremely slowly, gripping the shotgun with my fingers slippery and bruised by the cold. I unlocked the heavy steel latches of the thick basement door and entered the hallway of my home, immediately encountering a scene of utter physical annihilation. What had once been a cozy and safe ranch now resembled the epicenter of a high-impact detonation. The main entrance door, which housed 6-inch industrial bolts and strong solid oak crossbars, had been completely obliterated from its original frame. The fragmented pieces of the door were scattered across the living room carpet for almost 30 feet. The rustic furniture that made up the living room was reduced to shattered rubble, unrecognizable pieces of broken wood and torn fabric. The deep claw marks embedded in the floor formed rough and terrifying furrows that visually evidenced the immense driving power of the bipedal beast. But in that precise moment of primal survival, I didn't stop to lament the absurd property damage. My only mission in life was to get out of that territory urgently and ensure the preservation of the visual evidence I had managed to record on the electronic equipment before the destructive attack began. I walked over the barbed rubble with extreme and silent care, went straight to my ransacked office on the second floor, and extracted the small memory card from the panel of my severely damaged surveillance system. There resided the definitive recording of that terrifying monster, staring at the night vision lens 80 feet away, pointing its immense claws at my house. With the card hidden deep in my jacket pocket, I hurried through the destroyed opening in the facade, quickly climbed into the cab of my pickup truck, which, by some inexplicable blessing, was intact, and sped violently down the winding dirt road. With each dusty mile I left behind on the extensive escape route toward the safe city of Taos, I still felt the suffocating weight of an unseen gaze burning into the back of my neck. I never physically returned to the confines of that cursed property in Taos. I instructed a local lawyer to sell the impressive 800 acres of land and the dilapidated house at any cost, completely discarding the overwhelming financial loss that had accumulated to tens of thousands of dollars in lost funds. I don't give a damn about the money left behind, for I carry with me irrefutable proof that humanity, with all its technological arrogance, definitely does not occupy the solitary top of the terrestrial food chain. I possess the genuine and terrifying images of the formidable 800-pound monster walking upright on two muscular legs, dominating the night environment as the absolute lord of its own territory. And far beyond the visual records, I carry the permanent psychological scars of those long, freezing hours I spent crammed into that concrete basement at 10 degrees Fahrenheit, awaiting the exact moment when my flesh would be torn apart by savage jaws. All of this traumatic experience shattered my urban illusions and brutally taught me that the vast, isolated spaces of the United States harbor ancient and merciless horrors, colossal entities that thrive in oblivion, and that invading their domains is our most fatal mistake. If you have the courage to walk through the remote forests of this country at twilight, engrave this account in your memory as an undeniable survival warning, for the vast darkness is never completely empty and uninhabited. If you possess a dark fascination with encounters with DOGMAN, profound narratives, and authentic accounts of extreme psychological terror that test the limits of the human mind, you have found your definitive place on YouTube. Don't consume this fear in isolation. Become a part of it. Subscribe immediately to the Mr. Nightmare Scares You channel. Activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future terrifying stories and dark legends that defy logic. And share this harrowing video with everyone you know who underestimates the unbeatable power of the night. Write in the comments what you would try to do to survive. If you were locked and surrounded in that isolated house, facing werewolf predators, because your perspective is essential to fueling our community dedicated to fear. Stay permanently safe. Double-check the insulation of your homes before sleeping. Avoid highways surrounded by dense vegetation, and always remember to check what's walking in the shadows behind you when the night wind suddenly stops. The world hides deadly beasts that modern maps refuse to document. Until the next nightmare,